Hello and welcome to a special video, a video that was voted for by my Patreon supporters. After I published my tier list videos, there were some of you asking if I could do more tier lists about some other aspects of the game, for example yellow cards or technologies. And while I do think it's an interesting idea, I also think it's maybe not the most useful thing to actually rate those cards into different tiers. And maybe the actually useful thing about the Leaders and Wonders tier list that I did was also that I talked about the strengths and weaknesses of each leader, some combinations that you have to have in mind, and maybe the best way to get the most out of a specific leader or wonder. And with that, I thought it could be an interesting idea to just instead of doing more tier list videos, maybe doing some sort of a 3Hs talk, maybe a little bit of a new format where we'll talk about a specific topic. And the topic that we are going to take a look at today are the H1 events. And I will be very interested to see how this will be going. I'm definitely interested in hearing your feedback after you watch the video, what can be improved. I do think it's maybe also a format where it could be interesting to have a guest at some point when I will maybe talk about another topic in a future video. Today I'm alone, but for a future video it could be interesting. And yeah, so we will take a look at the H1 events today. And I thought that I will structure it that I will first talk about the global gain events, cards like Scientific Breakthrough, Good Harvest. Then I will talk about the global loss events, like for example Rats and Pestilence. Then I will talk about the Happy Face related events, then the strength events, and if there hasn't too much time already passed, then I will also talk about the colonies at the end. And if there has already a lot of time passed, then we will maybe do a special video about colonies, as those are also maybe that's a topic that you potentially can go very deep in. And now, so let's just start talking about those events, and we will start, as said, with those global gain events. And as those, I count first of all the 4 events that just give you an additional production: the Scientific Breakthrough, who will make the civilization score science equal to the production, and a Good Harvest for food, new deposits for resources, cultural influence for culture. And as I didn't find another nice category to put the knowledge of the ancients, and I will also talk about the knowledge of the ancients as in this first category of events. And of course, when you take a look at those events, maybe when you start playing the game, the first instinct is to say, all right, when I see the new deposits, then that will be the better event for those who will gain more resource out of it. The Scientific Breakthrough is the better event is the best for the player who has maybe the biggest science production. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but for example, in the 3Hs Discord, I definitely sometimes heard maybe a player asking the question on, is the Scientific Breakthrough actually the best for the one who gets the most science out of it? Because if you are having a lot of science production, then you maybe don't need additional science as much as when you have low science production, and then when you have low science, gaining only maybe 2 or 3 additional science out of this event can be extremely helpful. And so maybe it's even more useful for those with a low science production and can, or at least has the potential to be really helpful. And of course, there's no general answer to whether what of those things is true. My tendency is that generally you should still, of course, see those events and in situations where you maybe will have the bigger production, but you definitely have to be careful if maybe a player is extremely low in science, if maybe you should hold this event back, even though you maybe have the potential to get more science out of it than one of your opponents. And I think those global gain events, especially Scientific Breakthrough, Good Harvest, New Deposits, have the potential to be very helpful. And with that, I do think when seeding those, it's also very, very relevant in general when talking about those events. It's very relevant to take a look at how much the current event deck has already progressed. Because if you seed one of those events, and you know the event deck is just about to flip, then you know very likely in the near future those events will be resolved, and you maybe can just know relatively certain on how much production each player will have and how useful the resources or science will be for those players. However, if you seed one of those events just at the start of a new event deck, then it could definitely take quite a long time until some of those events will be revealed. And maybe you seed, for example, the new deposits into the deck because you have some iron upgrades, but then it will be revealed quite a bit later on, and one of your opponents has upgraded to coal, maybe just in time, and gets more resource out of it because he was on lower production for longer. The resources maybe also actually mean more to your opponent in the situation. So I am a little bit careful with seeding those if I don't know for certain, or if maybe it will take some time potentially until those events will be revealed. But of course, sometimes you just want to see it. It's also good to have information in the deck. That's maybe one general thing to note about seeding events into the deck, that just the culture that you get from it and having more knowledge about it are already some benefits that maybe you should make it that when in doubt, maybe just see it. But of course, you also have to be very careful about what events could be revealed. But I do think when you see it a lot, you can just prepare maybe potentially for the events that are coming. And yeah, so when you hit one of those events, after you maybe have just upgraded to coal or scientific method, that can be extremely strong because your production maybe in that area was lower for a while, and now you really want to get that science or resources over the next turn. And if then an event like new deposits or scientific breakthrough is revealed, that can really give you a big boost. And with that, I actually sometimes try to just create those situations on purpose, and I do this with really prioritizing those events to keep in my hand. If I see that I have the potential to maybe, if I have, for example, some iron mines, and at the moment I'm at low production, but I know that maybe Universitas is coming, or just scientific methods, Newton is maybe in the game, then I sometimes actively try to actually leave the scientific breakthrough in my hand. And if I then seed it later on in H2, maybe after I've just upgraded to scientific method, maybe even have gotten Newton, then that has just some extreme potential. And so those global gain H1 events are some events that I'm sometimes that I prioritize relatively highly on wanting to keep them if I think that they could give me a big benefit, or if I have had a nice science start and I know that I, without any problems, maybe also with having already some rich lands in hand, can go for coal in H2, then keeping those new deposits and maybe creating a situation where those are revealed after I have just completed the coal upgrades could also be extremely strong. And so that is maybe an interesting aspect to have in mind. Then, of course, for an event like New Deposits and also Good Harvest, also, of course, Scientific Breakthrough, it's not, you not only have to think about what amount of resources are you gaining out of it, but also how nicely is the civilization prepared to actually spend those resources. Maybe something that's not easily foreseeable, but for example, if you have some iron mines, but maybe some H1 wonders have already been discarded early, and it's maybe unclear on whether you actually find a nice project to use some additional resources on, then maybe you should rather be a bit careful about seeding those new deposits, because if you get 6 additional resources, but those will just be lying around for a while, or maybe even cause corruption, and the ones with bronze mines maybe get a big help out of the new deposits to actually do some stuff that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do, then that could be quite bad. So you really, in case you have some early iron mines and seed new deposits, I do think it's of very big importance that you make sure to have actually a nice project to sink those resources into that you will get out of the new deposits. Otherwise, maybe it will indeed not be the best event for you, even though you maybe gained the most net amount of resources out of it. And the same is also true for the Good Harvest. For the Good Harvest, you maybe also sometimes have to do some calculations. Of course, if you get early irrigation, then maybe it's just a nice event to see it. It's also an event that you maybe can keep in hand and wait until you get something like selective breeding, then get a very big boost out of it in H2. But if you have just those 2 A agriculture farms, then when you think about whether to seed Good Harvest or not, it's of course difficult when you get it very early, but if the end of H1 is relatively near, then it will often be you will often be in a situation where you will just get in the next area of your yellow bank and will go down to 0 food production. And then you have to really think about what will the food actually do. Maybe you will be in that area and you would have one food saved up, and then you have three, but it costs you 4 to increase your population, so the good harvest is basically not really giving you anything apart from maybe having corruption issues. But if you maybe can see maybe the developments are already out, or maybe developments that could change the amount of your food or population, and you see that you will go into H2 just with having 2 food saved up, and the 2 food from the good harvest would actually mean getting additional population, then I think it's a very, very helpful event. So I do think some calculations about how your situation will be after losing the 2 yellows to the end of H1 are very important when thinking about to seed a good harvest into the deck. And then of course also it's a little bit you have to think about, same as for the new deposits, what can you actually do with additional population. If you have some printing presses and drama, then of course the more population you have the better, but if you have already some population lying around and no clear use for those, maybe you should be a bit careful with seeding the good harvest, especially if maybe the other players have some printing presses or some things where they can easily put a lot of additional population in. So those are maybe some general thoughts, and then we also have of course the cultural influence, an event that maybe in the early game is a relatively safe and neutral amount event to seed, because the amount of culture production in the early game is relatively low, and gaining culture in the early game is something that won't help you snowballing into other benefits, meaning that it's oftentimes a relatively safe event to see, just if it is in your interest to move the event deck forward, maybe because you are prepared for the military, or you just want to have a bit of information about the event deck. It's just an event that you can relatively safely push. But same as for the other events, it's also an event that can potentially be strong to keep in your hand, because maybe if you have taken a drama in hand, know that Bachen is in the game, if you set up Bach maybe at the middle or the end of H2 and you time the cultural influence that it is revealed relatively late, it can be a card that can give you a similar amount of cultures, like a big impact. Maybe sometimes I've definitely seen a cultural influence giving a player plus 10 culture against the others, something like just winning impact of culture in H3, which is very strong. So also an event that can potentially be nice to keep in hand for longer if you think that you maybe have the potential to go into a bit of a more culture heavy strategy. So yeah, in general, just if you think that you have potential to really get a big boost in H2 in one of those areas, think about if maybe it could be worth it to just keep that one event in hand for longer and time it nicely, because that is really a strong way to get some big benefits out of those events. Alright, and then in addition to those events, we also have the Knowledge of the Ancients, the one global gain event from H1 that isn't coupled to your production, meaning that that is of course an event that you really want to see it if you are maybe on low science. If you maybe got into iron early but haven't upgraded your science, then something like Knowledge of the Ancients is of course very strong. And if maybe one other player has an additional wonder, it doesn't matter, just you maybe need the science a lot more, and then that can be a very strong event, also a relatively safe event, because the number of wonders doesn't vary a lot in the early game. Sometimes, of course, if you're playing Michelangelo, if maybe one of the players has skipped the HA wonder, it can just be better for some players. But apart from that, mainly you should consider how much the science is needed. And if you go for an early alchemy with Leonardo, maybe you rather not seed this event, as you have some strong science already anyway. Alright, so that were my thoughts about those global gain events. Of course, you could talk even more about them, but let's keep it with that. And let's move on to the global loss events. And I think there are 3 of them. One got introduced with the expansion, I think, the Dark Ages, making each civilization lose half of their surplus science. Or this, yeah, you know how it works. For the amount of science that you have more than 4, you will lose the half of it. Then we have Rats and we have the Pestilence, so 3 events that are just harming all of the players. And let's maybe talk about those 2 events first, the Rats and the Pestilence. And it's interesting in some sense, because both Rats and Pestilence making all players lose something that basically lose some population. I mean, the food will help you get more population, so if you lose some food, you lose some population, but the Rats is generally an event that you want to seed maybe if you have no upgraded farms, while the Pestilence is an event that you maybe want to seed if you have upgraded farms. So even though it's a global loss in a similar sense, it still is a bit different on how you want to play around it. And no, so the reds, of course, if you see someone going into early irrigation, it's really a nice way to punish them, especially also something like Machu Picchu. Um, if you see someone having that wander and getting into irrigation, the reds can just be devastating and make them lose a lot of food. You still have to be careful. Maybe if you seed it and just after the event deck has already flipped, it could take a while until it will be revealed. And maybe you are in a situation you have already iron and alchemy going, and a natural next development to your civilization would maybe be to upgrade your farms to selective breeding. And if it then takes a long while for the reds to be revealed, then maybe you are limiting the ways on how you can improve your civilization during Age 2 when the reds are in the deck. But yeah, especially if you know that it will be revealed relatively quickly, then of course just seed it and try to hit some food. You can prepare for it nicely, just always make sure that you don't have a lot of food saved up. If you know that you will have a lot of to do, some actions that need to spend, then of course you also have to be careful, because maybe it could be nice to be allowed to have some food saved up. So but if you know or think that you will have always the civil actions to increase your population after maybe having accumulated a little bit of food or maybe gotten some of the HA developments, then just see the reds maybe if you have no additional upgraded farms, and see that maybe the other players have some. Then the pestilence, each civilization will lose a population, and I think it's a very nice event to see if you go for some early food upgrades, because you can just, with going for early food upgrades, you know that I don't like it too much, and it's sometimes just a bit tricky to actually put the population immediately into good use. Sometimes you have some nice thing to do, either you go for a lot of military, or you have something like printing press and drama and can build those very nicely, but sometimes if you go for early food, it definitely can happen that some population will just be lying around, and then you don't really have those snowballing effects that you want. But with the pestilence, you can just make nice use out of the additional food, because instead of maybe just putting those populations somewhere, you will just lose one without it harming you in any way, but with the potential that your opponents get hit by it quite heavily. So yeah, that's a nice event to see it, of course, when going for early food production. And generally, of course, you have to think about what do you want to do with your population? If you go for early food, but you also have a printing press in hand, and Yanchishka is maybe one of your opponents has Yanchishka, maybe you need to also put a lot into the military. You have to be careful with seeding it, even when you have some additional food production. And if you have maybe a situation with no additional food production, but you just know you have some population lying around and there is not really a good way to put it anywhere, then you can also maybe just seed a pestilence and just make sure to have a free population. If you see that at the moment all the population of your civilizations are committed, that maybe the most of the times happens at the end of age 1 than the beginning of age 2, and then sometimes the population income, if the opponents didn't upgrade their food production, has stopped. And if you then see all of the opponents have actually committed all population elsewhere, and getting hit by the pestilence would mean that they have to destroy something, while you maybe also have no additional food production, but having a free population lying around that you maybe can't use anyway because it's an unhappy worker or something, then of course the pestilence is also just a very nice event to seed. But also definitely an event that you have to be very careful about, because if you are not nicely prepared for it, it can be very devastating. If you see that, of course, you have the knowledge, but sometimes you just need to maybe compete in the military, and then you get hit by the pestilence, have to destroy a lab or a mine, and that can be very painful. So really make sure and think about whether you can actually spare a population to this event, and maybe spare it more than your opponent. Sometimes it will damage you, but it will damage your opponents more, and then it can still be a nice event to push, but definitely an event to be very careful about. And then the last global loss event is the Dark Ages. And no, the Dark Ages, for that it's maybe similar, a question like for the scientific breakthrough, is the player who loses more actually, if you have a good science production at the end up losing a little bit more than your opponents, is it actually that bad for you, because you have maybe a lot of science anyway, have maybe invested already into some important technologies? So I do think you can seed this event even if you have some decent science production. Um, there's one thing that I sometimes make it dependent on whether I'm willing to push the Dark Ages without knowing for certain how nicely I will be prepared for it, and that is whether I already have a government form or not. Because if you go into H2 without a government form, it can just be nice, or sometimes you just start saving up some food to get into an H2 government form, and then it is very bad to get hit by the Dark Ages. So if I am still in despotism and I don't know for certain when I will have a chance to get into a government form, I'm definitely a bit more careful with seeding those Dark Ages. But if I maybe got into an early monarchy, and I know I can just always develop some technologies, and I have my government form already. Of course, also with being in despotism, you always can develop some technologies as a preparation for Dark Ages, but then that means that your government form gets delayed. But if you have already a government form, you just know you can always invest maybe into blue techs and to some other technologies. You have your government form already running, you have that important area of your civilization already fixed, and I think that makes it a lot easier to play around the science loss of the Dark Ages. So that's one thing that I make it a little bit dependent on whether I am willing to see the Dark Ages or not. And yeah, and apart from that, you just, as it is maybe for most of the events, and that's the difficult thing, but also one beautiful thing about this mechanism in Through the Ages, you just have to think ahead and think about how will the situation actually be when those events will be revealed, and that's definitely a nice skill that you can master in this game. And so it's of course also for the Dark Ages, and sometimes you just are in a situation where you can potentially plan multiple turns ahead, and you know that you will always have something to invest your science into. Maybe you will go into iron now, then you can go into alchemies 2 turns later, and you also have a code of laws in hand that you can invest your science in at some point. So if you have a clear plan for the next few turns, and maybe you also know that the Dark Ages will be revealed not very distant in the future, maybe if the event deck has just flipped, it's always a bit dangerous to see the Dark Ages if those maybe then will be revealed in quite a bit later after you seeded it. But if you maybe the event deck is already half flipped and you seed it and you have a clear plan on how to spend your science, maybe also without it looking suspicious, because you in preparation for the Dark Ages you can also give very easily some hints away to your opponents. But this event of course maybe can be the most devastating when it hits your opponent a little bit by surprise. So if you have a clear plan on how to spend your science, definitely see the Dark Ages, and then it can be quite strong. And yeah, if you have low science production, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should see the Dark Ages, because first of all, it can be nice having the ability to just save up some science. And if you at the end lose some science, it's just even more devastating. So I would maybe even be a bit more careful with being on low science production and being on high science production. Of course, if you're on high science production and you don't have a government form yet, and maybe you are on low civil actions and you can't spend easily a lot of civil actions on developing some technologies, then I also would be very, very careful with seeding this event. Developing technologies need some civil actions, so when you are only in 4 civil actions, it's a bit more difficult to play around events like Dark Ages, also Reds, so you can maybe not that easily prepare for those global loss events. Alright, so with that we have those 3 global loss events covered, and now we move on to the 2 happy face related events. We have the rebellion and then also the immigration that is just mixed in here between those strength events. I think those are somewhat nicely structured in the overview. We have the global gain events, the strength events, but the immigration for some reason is just in the middle of all of those strength events. And then those events at the end I think are events that got added by the expansion, so because of that those are at the end in the list. If you seed rebellion and immigration, if you get them very early, it's of course a good idea to take a look at what wonder is everyone having, and if someone has a wonder like Hanging Garden, Stonehenge, Colosseum, and it's guaranteed to get a happy face at some point, maybe you should rather be careful. But if the situation in that regard is relatively equal, it's definitely maybe not bad to see those events into the deck, because again, you have the knowledge about it, you can maybe prepare for it in the right moment and then get an additional population out of the immigration or not lose anything to the rebellion. Of course, if maybe all of the players have no happy face wonder, then it also depends on if you maybe already have a guess on how many nice and useful things you will have to do during your next turns. If you maybe have already iron in hand, maybe already is another thing that you can invest your resources and civil actions into, then it could be quite a distraction, maybe having to fix your happy phases because you seeded a rebellion early on, as it could maybe was as it seemed to be a somewhat neutral event. So definitely is also an aspect to consider. How much will it be a distraction? If you are low in science, then investing maybe some science into theology and bread and circuses can potentially be a bit bad. But generally, if the situation from what wonders the players have is relatively equal, it definitely can be a nice idea to just push those if you maybe are also in general somewhat nicely prepared for the next event deck, and then just try to prepare for them when there is the threat of them being revealed. Then with the immigration, of course, you also have to think about how much is the additional population actually needed. Maybe you have at the moment the most happy phases, but you know it will take a little bit of a while until it will be revealed, and I have some good food income, maybe I have already some additional yellow tokens because I have won a colony, and there is maybe the chance that the other opponent, who is at the moment in lower happy phases, but maybe will at some point build a team sports or organized religion and is really low in population and could get some really big benefits out of this event, maybe you should rather hold it back. So of course you not only have to take a look at the amount of happy phases that everyone is having, but also on how much would the one additional population actually be useful. And that's also maybe something to think about when seeding it relatively early. Of course, in the early game, it's not that easy to foresee how much population you will be needing. Generally, for the amount of population, something to consider is also someone like Jan Shishka, who maybe allows you to use some farms for military units, allowing you to have a decent amount of strength with low populations. With them maybe getting hit by pestilence is not as bad, and maybe you don't need an additional population of the immigration as much, but of course you also have the potential to maybe go for even more armies and then go for something really threatening. And yeah, the rebellion of course can potentially be a game-ending event for an opponent, but also for yourself, so definitely be very careful about it. If you have maybe two unhappy workers and not the most civil actions, you have to be really careful about seeding and should fix your happy phase as quickly as possible if you have no knowledge about it. So definitely rebellion, reds, dark ages, those are some events that if you don't have knowledge about them, you always have to have them in your head. So if you're maybe new to the game, those rebellion, dark ages and those reds, just always think about those events and what they would do if they would be revealed now. And if you have actually knowledge about them, you can use the knowledge to your advantage, with maybe just not caring about fixing your happy phases, because apart from the rebellion, there's not really anything in H1 that really punishes you. There's the migration which rewards you, but missing out on that is not the worst thing that could happen. So yeah, if you have knowledge about those very potentially punishing events, that can be important knowledge. So you can sometimes be happy about drawing those events, even if you don't end up seeding them, just to have the knowledge about them. And also that's of course true for some other events potentially, but those are maybe some of the very big contenders in that area. So an event that you always have to have in mind if you don't have knowledge about it. And yeah, apart from that, maybe not that much to say. You could go more in depth about any of those cards, but maybe those were the most important events to things to talk about. Then the next events on my list are the strength events, and there are actually quite a bunch of them in H1. And it's interesting, we have some events that just punish the weakest or the weaker players. There we have the Call to Arms, the Reign of Terror, the Barbarians to some extent, and the Raiders. Then we have only one event actually. We have more of them in H2, but in H1 we have only one event, the Foray, which only rewards the stronger players. And then we have three events, Uncertain Borders, Border Conflict, and Crusades, who give a reward to the strongest player, but also will damage the position of the weakest players. And when we take a look at the distribution, with the Foray in H1 being the only event that only rewards the strongest, we can see that a leader like Nostradamus, who helps you avoid being weakest for events, is actually really useful, because Apart from Foray, he helps you against all of the other strength events in H1. Only in H2 we have events like Cold War and International Agreement, where Nostradamus again doesn't help, but those events are maybe revealed a little bit later on anyway, so the H1 events I think are more relevant for Nostradamus oftentimes. And there he just helps for a lot of those events, which is definitely important when you think about how strong Nostradamus potentially is, and only the Foray is an event where he helps you not at all. And yeah, maybe we can first talk about the events that just result in a loss. And there we have the Call to Arms, the Raiders, the Barbarians, and also the Reign of Terror. The Barbarians is of course a special event because, in contrast to all of the other strength events, that one can only hit the player who has the most culture. So that's an event that's not that it's not that difficult to figure out how you want to use it. If you don't have the most culture, you can easily seed it and try to let the player with the most culture lose an event. If you have the most culture, you definitely don't want to seed it. It's not a lot to say about it. If it's unclear whether you will have the most culture or not, maybe you should be a bit careful about seeding it, especially if you're not confident whether you will be able to avoid being one of the two weakest or not, because it's just an awkward event if you have to end up playing around it, because you sometimes for some reason end up with the most culture, despite having knowledge about this card. It's a bit annoying because for other strength events, when you play around something like Reign of Terror, then you at the end don't get hit by it, but another player gets hit by it. But for the Barbarians, you don't get hit by it, but just nothing else happens. So if it's unclear whether you have the most culture, maybe be a bit more careful, unless you maybe have clear unless you have really good chances to be some of the stronger players anyway. Then the other events that make you lose some stuff are the Reign of Terror, the Raiders, and the Call to Arms. And out of those three, I think the Raiders are probably the least hurtful event most of the time. So of course, for all of these events, there are situations where one can be more hurtful than the other, but losing a combination of your choice even of food and resources is oftentimes not that bad. If you have early iron upgrades, losing a little bit of resources maybe doesn't hurt you that much. And also sometimes after the end of H1, you sometimes have a little bit of food lying around anyway without doing anything, because you don't have any food production any longer, and then losing a little bit of food to the Raiders could even potentially help you facing corruption. So the Raiders, you can maybe see it into the deck without thinking about it too much. You have to maybe think more about it if you are still in bronze mines, because then you can potentially run into a situation, maybe you can just spend all of your food very nicely, and if you then lose 2 resources while being on bronze mines, that can be very painful. So then I would be a bit more careful, but especially if you got some early iron production going and you want to see it, you are afraid that you will lose to it, but just seed it anyway and maybe get the rewards of seeding that you were hoping towards. So the Raiders probably the least painful event out of those strength events. Then the Reign of Terror, losing a population is already quite a bit worse, because you maybe lose something depending on when it will be revealed and how your yellow bank is, but you will lose maybe an equivalent of 3 or maybe even 4 food if it is revealed in H2. You will lose the civil action that you need to increase your population again. Sometimes at least the token goes back into an area of into an area of the yellow bank that you cleared before, and then you maybe start producing a little bit of food again. But if not, then it's just relatively painful, and it's especially painful if you have no free population. Then you actually have to destroy something and you completely lose the population. So that's really an event that you don't want to get hit by. Of course, sometimes you have a bunch of free population lying around anyway, then you don't have to care about it too much. But yeah, it definitely can be very painful. And if you have knowledge about it being in the deck, of course, same as for the Pestilence, if you maybe don't find a way to avoid getting hit by it, at least make sure that you have a free population and don't have to destroy anything. And then the Call to Arms, I do think that event is an event that is a lot more swingy in how much it actually hits than maybe some of the other events. Of course, all of the strength events depend a lot on the situation, on how much damage they will do, how much gain they will give the player who will win the event, but I have the feeling for the Call to Arms it's especially swingy. There are situations where it can even be beneficial to get hit by the call to arms. For example, you are entering H2, you got into an early republic, you are low in military actions, only get a few draws, but you have lots of civil actions, then losing some civil actions to actually draw some more cards, especially in H2, where you maybe want to find a tactic and potentially some other cards. It can even be beneficial, interestingly, to but if you are low in civil actions and you really need to do a lot of stuff, it can be extremely painful. Maybe especially if you have a nice turn plan, for example, you have a revolution planned and it is extremely strong to pull this revolution off, and then you just lose the two or also only the one civil action to the call to arms, your revolution plan is destroyed, or if you need a lot of civil actions to finish your wonder and do some other stuff, it definitely can hurt your turn a lot, but it also can potentially be an event that is not too painful if you lose it. So things that you have to consider when seeding it are, first of all, how many civil actions do I have? How many things of my civilization have I already fixed? How many civil actions will I need to spend in the next rounds to fix those things? And how painful would it be to actually lose some civil actions? And of course also, how well am I prepared for strength? How big is the chance that I will end up losing that? And also, of course, you have to think those same thoughts for your opponents. How much would a civil action loss maybe suffer them, and how well are they prepared to increase their strength? And same as for all of the other events, as it is a very swingy event, it can be a bit dangerous to seed it into the deck if the event deck has just flipped and it can maybe be delayed by quite a while, then a lot can change. That's of course true for all of the strength events, while you maybe have Jan Žižka running for now. If maybe if some turns later you don't have Jan Žižka any longer, or Genghis Khan, and maybe you even have difficulties transition into a new tactic, and out of the sudden you could get hit by those strength events. So if really think about how long will I likely have my strength advantage, how easily can I get more strength, do I have population income, food production already, know that I have some populations coming in that I could put into the military if needed, or am I stuck at the current amount of military, and at some point maybe my opponents could overtake me, and then really think about on whether you want to push those strength events or not. And the call to arms, as it can be very swingy, maybe an event that you have to be a bit more careful about. Generally, of course, the strength events that are more swingy, offer more benefits, you have to be more careful about, and seeding something like, for example, the raiders that we just talked about. And yeah, so if the call to arms are revealed in H2 or maybe even H3, then of course the draws are maybe more valuable, while in H1 you only get H1 draws, which are maybe not that valuable. So that's also one thing, of course, to have in mind. Then we have the one event that just helps some players, and that's the foray. And yeah, of course, it's a really nice reward for strength push. Gaining a combination of your choice of 3 food and all resources can really help you. Maybe getting a new population out can maybe help you cementing the military lead that you're already having. Or you can put your population elsewhere, build up a little bit of economy. The resources can be very nice if you maybe did some investments into the military early in, and at a cost of maybe delaying the economy by a little bit, and gaining those things from the foray can be very nice. So always a nice event to seed if you are going for a bit of a strength push. If you are in a 3-player game, you have to be a little bit careful, because there's only one player who won't get the stuff of the foray, and most of the times, of course, if you are at the end one of the players who gets the foray, it was still very nice to seed it, but you have to have in mind that maybe it can also be an extremely helpful event for one of your opponents. So you have to think at least a little bit about it, on how much the additional resource or food could help one of your opponents, who maybe is the more likely one to win the foray at the end. And yeah, especially if you're on bronze mines, getting 3 additional resources can be extremely helpful, so then it can be a very strong event. But at least you have the choice here, so if you're on iron mines and maybe the resources are not as meaningful, you can still take the food. In general, you can take a combination of your choice. When you think about what combination to take, definitely think about how the food just take the exact amount of food that you actually can use nicely. Maybe you are stuck at 2 food, and if you take 2 food, you can increase your population, and then you can just take 2 food and 1 resource from the fray. If you still have a little bit of food production, you can do some calculations, how much population will you need at which time, and then take the amount of food from the fray that just make it work nicely. And then the resources, of course, if you need a resource to maybe finish a wonder turn earlier, for example, the Universitas, then of course take the resource and maybe don't be too much concerned about the food. Just the flexibility of the foray make it, I think, a very nice and strong event to win, and really a reward event if you go for a strength push. Then we have the 3 events that reward the strongest player and make the weakest player lose something. Those events are, of course, in addition to the foray, especially nice to see if you are going for a bit of a strength push. Maybe you have the Colossus and Sanson Caesar, maybe you have Jan Žižka, or generally Barbarossa, just a situation where you invested a bit into the military and have now military lead. Then, of course, especially in multiplayer games, those events are also, of course, in 2-player games, but it's a bit, you have to maybe think about these events a little bit differently compared, depending on which player count are you playing. Because in a 4-player game, when you seed an event, a strength event, and you don't know for certain whether you will be weakest or strongest, it's just relatively unclear, but you maybe want to push. For example, you want to open a development from HA that could help you finish a wonder turn early or something like this. Then you could definitely say that in a 4-player game you should rather see the border conflict than the Reign of Terror, because the potential that you can lose from the border conflict, you have to destroy something, is maybe not as bad as the Reign of Terror, where you lose a whole population, and sometimes if you don't have a free population you still have to destroy something, but you completely lose the population instead of it going into your free worker pool. So in a 4-player game you can maybe argue, of course it's still someone wins it and gets the additional resource, but you could argue that it is the safer event even to seed in the Reign of Terror, while in a 2-player game where it is a zero-sum situation and everything that helps the one opponent hurts you, while in a 4-player game if only one opponent gets a little bit of help from the event, it's maybe not too bad. And so then you really have to be careful, and the border conflict probably is the more swingy event in the Reign of Terror. So yeah. And those rewards can definitely make a strength push worth it. So if you have Ray and certain borders, border conflict, Reign of Terror, maybe call to arms, those events that are maybe more damaging, then strength push can maybe be quite successful. The 3 additional resources are again, of course, more useful for you if you don't have the most resource production, again depending on what project you're having. So similar to when I talked about the new deposits, what can you actually do with those resources, but normally you can definitely use those additional resources nicely. Sometimes you have to be a bit careful about the border conflict. I remember one specific game that I had where there was one last H1 event before the H2 events, and I was thinking about my turn, and one of the few events that could still be there was the border conflict. And I had a situation where I had upgraded my bronze mines all to coal, my HA labs all to scientific method. I had maybe something like organized religion, I think, but no HA religion, and I was just about to upgrade my farms, and my first thinking was that I should upgrade both farms, get a production going as quickly as possible. But then I thought about a border conflict, and later in the game, if you maybe have already upgraded a lot of stuff and maybe have no HA thing left, it can potentially be quite painful, because if I would have upgraded the second farm, then if the border conflict would have been revealed, the cheapest thing that I could lose to the border conflict would be the H2 farm, costing me 6 resources in a civil action. So just one little thing to have in mind, but that is maybe rare that something like this happens. Of course, there are other niche situations where getting hit by the border conflict can actually be a nice thing, because of course ideally you want to avoid it, but it will happen. And through the ages that you maybe sometimes need to destroy some stuff. And of course, if you have to spend the civil actions to do it. But if you get hit by the border conflict at the right time, then you maybe save the civil actions. Those situations are very rare, but they can happen. In general, maybe sometimes you can while you maybe wouldn't have destroyed something actively, it can maybe help you rearrange your population and put it elsewhere. For example, you've invested into printing presses and then the border conflict is revealed, you lose the HA lab, and then you can at least build another printing press, making that event maybe not too bad. Then we have the uncertain borders, maybe the most dangerous and potentially strongest strength event in H1. Gaining an additional yellow token and an opponent losing one is definitely a very, very powerful effect. Getting the yellow token can really help you accumulating some additional food, allowing you maybe to again have an additional free population because it covers up one of the happy phases and turn an unhappy worker into a happy one that you then can put somewhere. And then losing yellow token can be quite annoying because if you go very deep into your yellow bank early, that can just be annoying and be a bit limiting. I think it can be strong to have a good population income going later in the game, and it is maybe more difficult if you have already lost a yellow token. So a very powerful effect. If you are in a two-player game and you know that it's in the deck, then maybe it's even worth more to fight over those events, of course over this event, but also over the other events, because it's zero sum. So if you win it, and you know it's in the deck, you steal a yellow token from your opponent, meaning you gain one, your opponent loses one, basically giving you +2 yellow tokens when you compare your situation to your opponent. But now if it's the other way around, if you don't end up winning it and it's already in the deck, then you out of the sudden your opponent wins one and you lose one. So that's basically a 4 yellow token swing once the event is in the deck if you're on a 2-player game. So sometimes in 2-player games it happens that maybe a lot of strength events got seeded, both of the players have knowledge about it, and then it's just complete, the whole game resolves around each turn. The player gets stronger, players start to destroy some stuff, and both end up with a very weak economy. But because of the extremely big swing with an event like Uncertain Borders, each little step was maybe worth it along the way. Even though at the end you could maybe see, why did I destroy all of this? Maybe I should have just kept my economy and just accepted losing this event. But that can be very swingy. So in 2-player games, once it is in the deck, you definitely should try winning it. Of course, also in 3 and 4-player games. But if maybe at the end it happens that you just don't win it, but you also don't lose it, it's not too bad. And even if you lose it, this is of course bad, and you should definitely try to avoid it. But at least only one of your opponents gained an additional yellow token, and compared to basically the only one opponent that is in the game, how it is in a 2-player game. So once the strength events are on the deck, in 2-player games it's maybe even more important to try to not lose to them, unless you can maybe suffer the loss and still be in a nice position anyway. So the yellow token definitely a very powerful effect, and losing one definitely quite annoying. So one of the worst events that you can get hit by, and one of the nice events that you can win out of the H1 events. And then the last one of those events are the Crusades. For some time I really didn't care about culture in the early game, and I maybe even thought about the Crusades as a somewhat neutral event. The thing that you lose doesn't really actively hurt you in what you are trying to do with building up your civilization. It's just for culture, and if you win it, it's not that bad, so I just put it into the deck. And it's definitely true that probably together with the Raiders, it's the strength event that you can seed in without there being too much risk involved in seeding it. But nonetheless, I came to value early game culture also in 3 and 4-player games a little bit more. In 3 and 4-player games, I still think I seed it into the deck and I don't care too much about it, but especially in 2-player games, I have been a bit more careful about seeding the Crusades, because it's still a bit of a culture swing, especially in a 2-player game. And in a 2-player game, also the early culture can definitely be meaningful. If you have a culture lead, you can maybe just defend it. You have maybe it just is. I am a little bit more careful about it now than I maybe have been earlier in maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So, but as I said, it's the culture in the early game doesn't help you snowballing. If you lose something to it, it also isn't snowballing into a negative direction. It's just pure culture that you will have or not have at the end of the game. It's culture that definitely can potentially make the difference at the end, but it doesn't really hinder your development if you get hit by it, and it doesn't really improve your development in the early game if you win it. So an event that you maybe don't have to be concerned about too much, but also shouldn't take it completely lightly, because definitely the culture can make a difference at the end in a two-player game. Again, once it is in a deck, the Crusades are actually a 16 culture swing, because either you gain 4 and your opponent loses 4, and that's 8 culture in your favor, or it's 8 culture in your opponent's favor. So once it is in the deck, I definitely also put a little bit of effort into winning it in a two-player game, especially. Now, with that, we have talked about the strength events, and I will just take a very quick look at how long the recording already is, and then I will decide on whether we will now also talk about the colonies or not. Alright, we are at 50 minutes already, which I think is maybe already a good amount of time. I don't want to make this video too long. So we will maybe take a look at colonization in a separate video. Now, after we are through with talking about the H1 events, I'm definitely very interested in your feedback, because I now just talked about these events. Was that actually interesting for you, or maybe it was too much that was very clear for you already anyway? Or did you found maybe some aspects that were a little bit new to you? Was it maybe interesting for you regardless to listen to it? Definitely give me some feedback, and let me know if you maybe are interested in this format where I just talk about a specific aspect of the game. If you're interested in seeing that again for future videos, or if you say, rather an additional game analysis instead of something like this, I'm completely open, and definitely it was interesting for me to talk about it and also think about it beforehand on what I maybe want to say about those events. So I am very interested in hearing your opinion on to the to the special format, of course, but also, of course, to your opinion to those H1 events. Is there maybe something that I completely missed? Maybe I could have talked a little bit more about seeding in general. You, of course, have to evaluate what could be revealed, how potentially benefiting will be the event that you just seeded. So if you have some things that you want to add to the things that I just talked about, definitely also let me know in the comment. And with that, that was it for today. Thanks for watching. In this case, maybe even more just for listening. And yeah, have a nice time, and see you in the next video. I will be away for a week, and so there will be a little bit of time without any videos, so just that you know that. But then soon I will be back, maybe with the World Championship games, or maybe with one other kind of video if there's a bit of time in between.